Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for another Bookshelf Essential video. The Bookshelf Essential videos, this is a series of videos that was originally created by David Wiley over on his magnificent channel. And it's all about books that are essential to our personal libraries, books that we wouldn't get rid of under any circumstances. And I did a Bookshelf Essential video about The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. And I thought I should get around to talking about The Lord of the Rings, because that is definitely a bookshelf essential. Look, it's right over here. The Lord of the Rings is a book all of you know all about, probably. It's the most influential fantasy novel of all time. Tolkien did consider The Lord of the Rings to be one novel. He wanted to write one big work, and he did. One really big, epic fantasy novel divided up into 6 parts and published as 3 different volumes. And all of you know all about The Lord of the Rings. So I will not give a synopsis of a book you already know all about, but I wanted to talk about my personal experience with this book and my feelings about the work. I experienced The Lord of the Rings for the first time when I was very young. I was a teenager. I actually kind of avoided it for a while because I loved The Hobbit. Loved The Hobbit. And I knew that The Lord of the Rings was going to be very different. It had a different feel to it once you just start reading it. It was a much more complex novel, and it dealt with characters that I was unfamiliar with. Bilbo Baggins does not play the major part in Lord of the Rings, and that kind of put me off because I was a big Bilbo Baggins fan. And I was really young when I had read The Hobbit. So I first read Lord of the Rings when I was probably 13 or 14. I don't remember exactly. I just remember I was young. And it was actually probably before that, but it was around there. And the edition that was my edition of The Lord of the Rings is this one. This is the Silver Jubilee edition. It's a little worse for wear because this has been hanging out with me for decades. This came out in the 80s. This is the version that I always read when I read The Lord of the Rings. I have the fancy version, but let's be honest, that's probably just going to stay on the shelf forever unread. Whenever I read The Lord of the Rings, it's probably going to be in this edition. This is the one I love. And this is actually the edition that has the covers that influenced how I kind of saw The Lord of the Rings in my mind. And this has covers by, was it Sweet? Is the artist's name, right? Let me make sure. Yeah, Daryl K. Sweet. Daryl K. Sweet did the covers. And the covers are really cool. Of course, this edition has The Hobbit, which is just beat to hell. My edition of The Hobbit looks like it's just been, like I carried it all the way to Mordor. You can see the picture better from The Hobbit there. It's a beautiful illustration. And then, of course, the Lord of the Rings proper begins with the Fellowship of the Ring. I love that image of the Fellowship of the Ring. Very different from the style that you would see in the films, the look of the films. So in my mind, Lord of the Rings looked a lot more like this. And then we have the cover to The Two Towers right there by Sweet. Great cover. And then we have The Return of the King, the final part. Love this edition of Lord of the Rings. And I experienced The Lord of the Rings a long time ago in the 1980s. And that informs the way I kind of think of this series of books because I experienced these books long before the movies came out. And I think the movies, they were really good movies for one thing. And I think they have really changed people's perceptions of the Lord of the Rings. I think a lot of people now, because the movies are their first experience with the story, they go into the novels after having seen going to the novel after having seen the films. And so you know how that goes when there is a film you really love and then you read the book. That film is always on your mind, and that kind of influences how you see the characters in the world. Very often that's the case. It's not that way for everybody, but I think very often that's the case. I didn't have that. I didn't have the films. When I was younger, we had the cartoons. There were some J.R. Tolkien cartoons. There was the feature-length film cartoon, which told about half of the Lord of the Rings, but they never made the rest of it. And we always thought that if they ever made another Lord of the Rings movie, it would have to be animated, right? Because you couldn't do it, in our minds back in the 80s. You just couldn't do it any other way because CGI was in the future, and we just couldn't imagine the kind of special effects that would be possible once CGI took off. And indeed, the films are quite good. I enjoyed the films, but they do seem to me to have a very different feel and tone to them than the books did, which is as you would expect. And the books, like I said earlier, do have a very different feel to them than The Hobbit did, which is a much more simple story. And the books have a heavier feel to them, definitely. Which is not surprising considering when they wrote and when they were written and Tolkien's own experience with actual war. Whether he liked it or not, those experiences were going to inform his writing of this story. And this story is at times quite dark, and it deals with some very dark themes, some very adult themes, actually. And it's full of just terrifying creatures and scary situations. And the heroes of this book are mostly ordinary. A lot of the fantasy that I've always read and that a lot of people enjoy, those fantasy stories are populated by characters that are sort of larger than life. Hobbits are not larger than life. They are fantastic creatures, I suppose, but really they're ordinary people. That's the whole thing about hobbits. They're ordinary people who, in this story, have to deal with an extraordinary situation. And that is what makes this book great. Or one of the things that makes this book great. There's a lot of things that make this book great. It's just a magnificent story. I love the way it's told. I love how intricate it is. You will get some complaints about the length and how long things take and that sort of thing. I've even seen some people on BookTube say that the films were better than the book, which is absurd. That's just ridiculous. The book is just magnificent and wonderful. And it's an incredible story. And that's why this was so popular and influential. I think back in the 1980s when I first experienced this, for most people, if they wanted to get a fantasy novel published, it had to be kind of like The Lord of the Rings. Sometimes it had to be a lot like The Lord of the Rings. We had a lot of the Lord of the Rings kind of clone books floating around back in those days. Fantasy has turned into something entirely different. And it is a much more robust genre now. Much more diverse. You can tell a lot of different kinds of stories in fantasy. No longer do you have to be like the Lord of the Rings. You could write all kinds of different fantasy stories nowadays. And it's just an extraordinarily popular genre. I mean, when I first started watching BookTube, it just seemed like that's what people talked about, was fantasy and nothing else. But back when I first read these, that wasn't the case. Tolkien was not a classic author back then. He was highly regarded, and this was a fantasy classic, but that put it on a lower level than real classic literature. Its status is much higher now than it was then. For a long time, The Lord of the Rings was kind of like an underground classic in the 60s and into the 70s. And it gained popularity over the years. And when I read it, it wasn't unique. Like I said, there were a bunch of other Lord of the Rings books around, but it kind of stood alone as the magnificent fantasy classic. It kind of still does, but now there's just so much else that you can read in fantasy. But these will always have a huge place in my heart and in my library. It will always exist. I will always carry these tattered paperbacks with me wherever I go in life, because this edition, these books themselves, because they took me away to this story, I have a great affection for the physical objects, these books. I just love them to death. And this right here is how I will always picture this world that Tolkien created. We all picture stories like this in different ways in our own minds. Because of these covers, and that these were the editions that I read, this is how I will always see these characters and this world. A magnificent place to go to. And I really need to revisit this novel. And I will shut up because I've gone on and on. I will catch you next time.